Imagine you're at a basketball game or football, or if sports aren't your thing, perhaps imagine you're at your favorite concert. The feeling that you get that almost transcends the individual. There's an energy in the crowd. It's almost electric, right? This feeling of connectedness with people that you don't know. Sometimes this feeling can spawn violence in a group setting. And what we're talking about here is often referred to as collective violence. It's important to distinguish, though, between a crowd and a mob. Right? A crowd is nothing more than a collection of people who may or may not share a common purpose. Imagine being at a busy mall. People might be there shopping for birthday gifts or getting away from an argument at the house, or maybe they're just wandering about. Right? There's a crowd there, but they're not necessarily engaging in any sort of collective behavior. Right? A mob is, on the other hand, right, a crowd that is perceived to be out of control. So in this way, a mob definitely is understood as having more of a collective purpose or shared purpose. Okay, and typically mobs are portrayed quite unflattering. Right? They're seen as unruly and inconsistent and unpredictable. But usually they form as a response to something, to a perceived injustice or to some sort of perceived oppression. So they form as a way of acting against those in power. Now it's important that much has been the case for many forms of violence, for sexual violence, for assault. It's easy to think about collective violence or collective behavior as existing on a continuum. Now this is straight from the textbook. Okay, you have on one side, you have the least organized form of mob violence or collective violence, which are riots, and that kind of extends all the way through vigilante groups. Okay, now the textbook will go through different types of crowds, and you'll see some notes here in these slides that will be useful for you. But for us, what I really want to focus on is kind of how these groups come to be. And the main piece here is this notion of collective behavior. In fact, there's a theory, collective behavior theory, that was developed to explain how these crowds and mobs come to be. And the simplest way to think about it is that we all have our own individual identity. We know who we are, where we fit in the world, and we at least have some understanding of our own personal identity. But we also have what is referred to as a social identity. And this is kind of how we see ourselves in the group, right? And if you think about that favorite sports team or that favorite concert, you feel connected to those people around you, whether or not they're complete strangers. And so in this setting, right, our identity becomes enmeshed in the group. And so if some of the group starts engaging in violent behavior or reckless behavior, we're more likely to do it, even if it's out of character for us. Because in that moment, our collective identity, our social identity, is more prominent than our individual. So how does crowds typically become a mob? It usually first relies upon some sort of trigger, right? And so this could be anything that is exciting or interesting and draws people together. Okay, it could be something like a police shooting in a minority neighborhood, or perhaps it could be the Casey Anthony verdict when she was found not guilty. Right, when people have this kind of event that triggers a deep emotion in them, especially when it's a group of individuals, it's more likely that they'll come together, right? And so once we have some unity amongst a common element, usually an emotion, right, our connection to each other grows. And that can compel us then to behave with the group as opposed to our own individual identity. And now we see nowadays mobs are portrayed a little bit more rational than they have, but it's because mobs often are rational. They're reacting in response to something they see. Remember, rational means nothing more than we look at the potential outcomes of our behaviors and then we make the choice that's going to have the most benefits for us and the least costs. So in the group context, right, if we think that what's happened is unfair and we think that coming together as a group and acting out against the police is going to help get our message across, then we are behaving rationally. And another form of, a very specific form of collective violence is known as vigilantism. Okay, and so this is an organized extra-legal movement, in other words, all that means is it's an organized movement where we take the law into our own hands. Maybe we think that there has been a failure to get justice. Perhaps, let's say in the Casey Anthony case, a group of individuals decided to hunt her down and bring their own justice. Okay, they're going above and beyond and around the law to try to find justice in their own way. Right, and so in other words, it's an attempt to impose law in a lawless setting. So the law failed, and now we're going to bring our own. Okay, and there's a number of different types. Okay, there's crime control vigilantism. Okay, and this is, right, the goal is to get rid of crime. So if you've ever seen, a lot of the comic book movies have this element in there. Watchmen, The Watchmen is a key example of this, if you've seen those, right, where these various superheroes come together to try to stop crime because they don't see the laws being successful of doing so. There are social group control vigilantisms, and this is, rather than to try to impose the law, we're trying to keep one group, usually perceived as being lower than or less than, under control. Okay, these are the most similar to lynch mobs, these social group control vigilantes. There's also regime controls, and so these are trying to control the government. So unlike the crime control, where we're trying to, impose the law where the law has failed, regime control is imposing the law upon those in power. And the last are guardian angels. This is actually a specific type. This is the name of a vigilante group, and they actually wear red berets, and they patrol the subways, neighborhoods, communities, streets, and they try to prevent crime. They are still active today. They formed in the late 70s, early 80s, and they act as something of a neighborhood watch, but oftentimes the police recognize them as vigilantes because they're not authorized by the law to act as they do, yet they do all the same. Now, think about what examples you might be able to come up with of vigilantes. If you've ever seen the movie Boondock Saints, that's one of my favorite movies of all time, but also an excellent example of vigilantes. And keep pondering these and start thinking of other examples of different types of crowds that might develop into a mob.